The device that finally gave radio a human voice was built by a man who died with $1,250 in the bank, in a rented Hollywood room, still convinced the world had cheated him out of the credit. His name was Lee DeForest, and in 1906 he added a third electrode to a vacuum tube and created the triode, the component that powered radio, long-distance telephone, radar, and the first electronic computers until the transistor replaced it in 1947. So how does the man who made modern electronics possible end up bitter and nearly broke? Decades before anyone called him the father of anything, DeForest was a congregational minister's son growing up in the Deep South. He was born on August 26, 1873, in Council Bluffs, Iowa, but when he was around 6, his father, Henry Swift DeForest, took over as president of Talladega College in Alabama, a school founded after the Civil War to educate black students. The appointment made the family unpopular with some of their white neighbors, and the young DeForest grew up as an outsider in his own town, a boy who preferred building machines to making friends. He studied at the Mount Hermon School in Massachusetts, and then at Yale's Sheffield Scientific School, where he eventually earned a doctorate and started tinkering with the new science of wireless. Even then, the pattern that would define his whole life was already visible. He was convinced he was destined for greatness. He was also convinced that no one around him could quite see it yet. Within a few decades, he would understand exactly what that hunger could build, and exactly what it would cost him. That restless ambition finally found something to attach itself to. A British physicist named John Ambrose Fleming had built a 2-electrode vacuum tube that could detect radio signals. DeForest took that design and did one deceptively simple thing to it. He slipped a third electrode, a bent wire called a grid, in between the other two, and that grid could control and amplify the current flowing through the tube. He called the invention the Audion, and he built it in 1906 before patenting it the following year, filing a rapid string of related patents as he went. It does not sound like much, a bit of wire inside a glass bulb, but that third electrode is the reason a faint radio signal could be boosted into something loud enough to fill a room, which is precisely what let radio carry speech and music into people's homes instead of dots and dashes. The triode went on to become the beating heart of long-distance telephone calls, of the radar sets used in the Second World War, and of the first electronic computers, and it held that job for roughly 4 decades until the transistor arrived in 1947. Almost every piece of electronics built in that stretch. The broadcasting boom that put a radio set in living rooms across the country, the transatlantic phone call, the early computing machines, traces back in some form to that one small addition he made inside a glass bulb. Radio could finally carry a voice, and DeForest had handed the 20th century its amplifier. Up to this point, DeForest had every reason to expect he was about to become rich and celebrated. That was about to flip, and it flipped because of the one skill he never had. He was a brilliant inventor who never had any real head for business. Over his lifetime, he was involved in something like 25 different companies, starting with the DeForest Wireless Telegraph Company in 1902 and the DeForest Radio Telephone Company in 1907. Business partners defrauded him more than once, and he had a habit of selling off valuable patent rights for far less than they were worth. He eventually sold his Audion rights to AT&T in pieces, roughly $50,000 in 1913 and another $90,000 for radio signaling rights the following year, sums that would look almost insulting next to what the technology went on to earn. And his money problems were about to become the least of his worries, because in March 1912, DeForest and 4 of his company's officials were charged with using the mail to defraud investors, over the way they had been selling stock in his radio venture. The trial came in late 1913, and 3 of his co-defendants were convicted of the scheme. DeForest himself walked out acquitted, but not before a prosecutor stood up in court and described his Audion as an absurd device that was probably useless. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the same invention a government lawyer called useless in 1913 would go on to run the entire electronic age. There was one fight, though, that would haunt DeForest for the rest of his life, and this one was about credit itself. A brilliant young engineer named Edwin Howard Armstrong had worked out how to feed a radio signal back through the triode to amplify it enormously, a breakthrough called the regenerative circuit. DeForest claimed he had gotten there first. What followed was one of the longest patent battles in American history, running from 1914 all the way to 1934, close to a dozen separate rounds in court. It reached the United States Supreme Court once in 1928, and then 6 years later, the case landed there a second time. On May 21, 1934, the court finally sided with DeForest, resting its decision largely on a single entry in one of his lab notebooks from 1912. On paper, he had finally won, but the version of this story most people know isn't the whole picture. The engineers and historians who actually understood the technology overwhelmingly believed the court had gotten it wrong, and that Armstrong was almost certainly the true inventor of the circuit. So DeForest walked away with the ruling, but Armstrong kept the respect of the people who best understood the machine. Think about what 20 years of that does to a person. 2 full decades of filings, appeals, and hearings, and even the victory came wrapped in a doubt he could never quite shake off. For a man who had spent his whole life chasing recognition, that outcome must have been hard to live with. So DeForest went looking for a new field to conquer, and this time he aimed at the movies. Between 1919 and 1920, he filed his first patents for recording sound directly onto film, building on earlier work by the Finnish inventor Erik Tigerstedt and the German Tri-Ergon group. His system, which he called Phonofilm, printed the sound as a thin optical track running right alongside the picture, so that image and audio lived on the same strip of film. It used what was called a variable density track, a different approach from the variable area system that RCA would later push. On April 15, 1923, he premiered his first commercial Phonofilm shorts at the Rivoli Theater in New York, years before Hollywood took talking pictures seriously at all. The studios of the early 1920s were not convinced that audiences even wanted their pictures to talk, and DeForest was pitching them a future they had not asked for yet. Between 1923 and 1925, his company wired more than 30 theaters for sound, reaching well beyond America into Europe, South Africa, Australia, and Japan. And then the pattern repeated itself, almost beat for beat. He worked with the collaborators Theodore Case and Freeman Harrison Owens, and then he feuded with them. And the timing of what happened next was almost cruel. Case walked away and took his expertise to Fox, helping build a rival sound-on-film system called Movietone, while Warner Brothers pushed its own disc-based system, Vitaphone. Both of them buried Phonofilm commercially, and DeForest's film company went bankrupt in 1926. Within just a few years, the major studios adopted sound-on-film methods broadly similar to the one he had pioneered, long after his own version had already collapsed. He had gotten there long before the major studios did, and by the time they caught up, his own company was already gone. If the story had ended at that bankruptcy, it would already be a hard one to sit with. But the recognition he spent his life chasing did eventually arrive, just never in the form he wanted, and never quite when he needed it. Recognition from his own profession did start to arrive, beginning with the Institute of Radio Engineers Medal of Honor in 1922, the Franklin Institute's Elliott Cresson Medal in 1923, and the Edison Medal in 1946. His friend Herman de Vries thought so highly of him that he named his own training school the De Forest Training School, the institution that would eventually grow into what we now know as De Vries University. What happened next, though, is the part of his story that is hardest to square. In 1959, at a ceremony in Hollywood, the Academy handed De Forest an honorary Oscar, citing his pioneering inventions, which brought sound to the motion picture. The man whose Phonofilm had gone bankrupt more than 3 decades earlier was finally being thanked for helping make the talkies possible. A star with his name went into the Hollywood Walk of Fame on February 8, 1960, and in 1977, 16 years after his death, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. And yet, for all of it, De Forest never seemed to feel that the scales had been balanced, and he was not always right about where the future was heading. Around 1926, he predicted that television, while theoretically feasible, would remain a commercial and financial impossibility. He stayed skeptical that human beings would ever travel to the moon, a position he was still defending in a newspaper interview as late as 1957. It is worth remembering that being wrong about the next technology is something nearly every great inventor has in common, and it takes nothing away from what he actually built. He also held a large number of patents over his career, most often described as several hundred, though the precise count is disputed and lands somewhere between roughly 180 and more than 300, depending on which source you trust. He married 4 times, and only the last of those marriages lasted. His 4th wife, the silent film actress Marie Moschini, stayed with him from 1930 until the end. He titled his 1950 autobiography Father of Radio, a name he insisted on for himself because he never fully trusted anyone else to hand it to him. When he died in Hollywood on June 30th, 1961, at the age of 87, there was $1,250 left in his bank account. The man who gave radio its voice, whose triode still hums inside almost every device that has ever amplified a signal, went to his grave believing the world had never really listened.